Hello and welcome, and thank you for tuning in to another podcast. And you're in for a really special treat today because long-standing friend has agreed to come on my podcast. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to my dear friend, Mr. Terry O'Regan. Mr.
Hey, thank you.
Terry. So good. And I was just saying to Terry while we were talking before the podcast started, what do I call you these days? Because you've been I think it's COO, CO, CT. I think you've done all the C's at some point in various companies. And I know you've had a lot of life changing. Maybe introduce yourself, Terry. What are you doing? What have you done? Give us a little bit of context.
Excellent. And Dave, thanks so much. It's a real privilege to just be having this conversation with you about things that we're both passionate about. So my background is pharmaceuticals. Primarily, as you say, I've had the good fortune of being in different roles. I was in classic pharmaceuticals with GSK and Merck and your big pharma. I then moved into more biotech, where I was the general manager for Biogen, which is a biotech company that specializes in neurodegenerative diseases. And it afforded me the opportunity to be the general manager. I was also the chairman of the industry group. And then I moved to the USA, where I managed about a $7 billion business, which was about 50% of Biogen's total turnover at that stage, looking at managing the neurology business in the USA, and then decided to make the move into more sort of startup, where I was CEO president of a startup company looking at autism and looking at epilepsy. And more recently, I've moved into, still in startup, but in the area of looking at blood tests, where we've developed a blood test that looks at the immune response to Alzheimer's, where you have basically the immune system tries to rid you of amyloid, which we know is a precursor of Alzheimer's. And the good news about this is we can detect amyloid at about a measurement, what we call 15 centiloid. And should you be able to keep somebody's amyloid levels below 25, they will never develop symptoms of Alzheimer's. Well, that is the hypothesis. That's what I'm involved in at the moment. And then I'm also, I'm also a partner in a consultancy group called Tillin, looking at how we help leaders lead at their best, and how we create environments and cultures within organizations that drive accelerated growth and high performance. So yeah, a little bit about me.
So you've done a little in your life. I see.
Yeah.
And I noticed that all of it is really meaningful and life-changing and world-changing work. And you've worked, what's interesting about your history is that you've worked in some of the biggest corporates that we know, and you've managed to work in startups, right? They couldn't be further apart from each other.
Yeah.
And that really says a lot about you as a person, your adaptability in your leadership style. And I really would like to talk and pick your brains about you, Terry, and your leadership. So this group that listens to this are all in varying stages of leadership. Some are entrepreneurs, some are in SMEs, some are in corporate. So I guess my first question for you is, when you look back over your career, your life in work, and specifically in leadership, what has shaped your leadership? What have been some of the things that have worked on you and in you and with you to develop you into the leadership that you are today?
Dave, I think there's a good and a bad side, a good and a bad side to that answer, because I think the thing that has shaped my leadership approach the most has actually been the poor leaders that I've been subjected to. And, I've worked in organizations where you had leaders that were overprotective or wanted to be everybody's friend, or know how to deliver sort of more challenging directives. And as a result, it just created a culture of entitlement and also mistrust, because people didn't really know if they could trust the response that you were getting. I've also worked in environments where the leaders have been very dominating and very authoritarian and very controlling. And I've seen how that created a culture of fear and manipulation. And then I also saw leaders that were absent. And as a result of that, there was a sense of apathy, that nothing really mattered, because the leader wasn't present. And we talk about the shadow of the leader. And what that made me realize is that we are casting a shadow, whether it's good or bad. We are influencing or impacting people and environments, whether we like it or not. And so it made me start to think about what is the shadow that I'm casting. But the other thing, and you know this because we've just been in South Africa together, where I brought some of the people that have shaped my life and have spoken into my life. And so, the antidote of being subjected to poor leadership was that I've also surrounded myself with really strong leaders and people like yourself that have really impacted and helped develop my leadership, held a mirror up to me and made me see where I was at my best and where I was at my worst. And then, walked the road or a path with me to make sure that I led more into my strengths rather than into my unintentional behavior that undermined my influence or my leadership. So yeah, I've been
Wow.
fortunate.
You one of the things that I've noticed about your leadership, and I've known you for over 20 years, Terry, is I'd say the word vulnerability and
Yeah.
teachableness. Two words: vulnerability and teachableness. Talk to me about vulnerability. How does it play in your life, and how have you managed to use it and be vulnerable the way you are?
So I don't think it was something that came naturally to me. And in some ways, my early stage of managing teams and overseeing groups of people, I almost want to go back and apologize to everybody that I led because I think, one of the things is I had to deal with wanting to be liked. And actually still to this day, I've got on every board that I have in my office, do the right thing, because it's not something that, sometimes telling somebody that they've got a certain diagnosis is important in order for them to know that there's a treatment available and
Right,
what it might,
right.
might mean. But I wasn't comfortable with that because I wanted to be loved. And I suppose, the vulnerability came, as I said, with people like you, helping me deal with those insecurities and then encouraging me to be vulnerable. That I started to realize that people weren't looking for perfect leaders. They were looking for authentic leaders. And that
Beautiful.
if I wanted to be a strong leader, I needed to be authentic.
Just say that last line again, Terry. That was just a major point.
That people weren't looking for perfect leaders. They were looking for authentic leaders.
Mm.
And then, for me, I think my definition of leadership is that leaders lead people, places, and business in a better place than when they found them. And so if I wanted to once again cast the shadow of my leadership, that was a place where people flourished and where businesses, performed. I realized that I had to be courageous enough to acknowledge that I didn't have all the answers and that I needed certain people around me that would make up for my blind spots or for my areas of development. And it was a necessity rather than it was a comfortable thing that I stepped into, you know.
But the
And
result,
it worked well, Dave. There was one moment in my career where it could have destroyed my business. And that was that our biggest drug, we had lost the tender on England. And it was 80% of my revenue. And I remember bringing my leadership team together and coming into my boardroom, which was surrounded by whiteboards so we could write all over it and all of that. And just saying, I don't know the answer to this, but I know the answer is in this room and we've got to turn it around. And we just literally, we threw everything into the mix. And eventually we came out with a strategy and we turned it around. Which was unheard of in the NHS, once a decision is made. But that is the power of vulnerability.
I love that. I mean, I think we probably needed a whole podcast just on that because,
Yeah,
vulnerability creates safety. When the
yeah.
leader is vulnerable, it creates a place of psychological safety in the room. People then feel they can be vulnerable. And then, safety leads to a measure of trust. They trust you because you have integrity, because you're expressing vulnerability and so on. Up to see on these five. I
Well,
think it's, yeah.
yeah, Dave. I'd say there's two things for that because, if all the time you were just being vulnerable and saying, I don't know the answer, then obviously the
Right.
team would lose trust in you. So I think there's three elements that I've had to learn, which is to know what I'm good at. And so one of
Mm.
the things, I'm a visionary. I can see the future before others see it. But don't give me something to proofread because I tell you there'll be glaring errors in it and I will miss every single one of them. I'm just not the, I just don't have that attention for detail. But I can see the wood from the trees. I can find solutions
Yeah.
when everybody just sees problems. So I had to learn what I was good at and play to those strengths. But then I also had to learn to give other people that were different to me a voice.
Mm.
And I think what I realized was that silence wasn't agreement. I had to, particularly for my more introverted leaders, I had to make sure I made space to hear that voice. And I think so the combination of vulnerability with also knowing your strength but also empowering others to have a voice
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
was the magical sort of ingredient for us to over exceed all of our targets.
Yes, yeah, that's powerful. There's so much to unpack here. And also there's this tension of being confident and not, leading strongly, lead to where you know you need to lead. And
Yeah.
then being vulnerable enough to say, I'm not good at that. I can't do that. I mean, thank heavens we've got AI now that reads documents for us, right? But it is walking in that tension, right? I'm confident and I'm vulnerable.
Yeah.
I'm strong and I also have my weaknesses. And that is the formation of good leadership. And I love it. You then create this open space for your team to become the best that they are, creating space for them to be confident where they need to be confident.
Yeah.
I've known you, I've known that one of your specialities is the way that you build team. And I know you've built some very strong teams that a lot of them have gone on to lead their own teams. I want to talk a little bit about conflict, how you deal with conflict within your team. So every leader has to deal with tension. How have you handled conflict in your team? How do you approach difficult conversations? Give us some advice around that.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that I had to learn, and having given you the background to my personality type, I had to learn to embrace conflict. That avoiding conflict actually just intensifies the conflict. It makes the problem bigger. And what I also saw is that and I think it's something that you taught me, Dave, which was that your culture will be defined by the poorest behavior that you tolerate.
Mm.
And so, I had to learn to embrace conflict. And I think that the thing that I had to learn was to take the emotion out of it. That often my interpretation of a situation was through the lens of my own insecurities or my own experience. And so I think the very first thing I had to learn was to put the problem on the table rather than the problem between me and the person. So just to literally say without judgment, this is what I observed and this is what I felt or this is what I experienced. Now let's talk about it. Or in a more business context, I gave you this task. It was really critical. We've missed the deadline. Help me understand what went wrong here. So it's not coming in and accusing immediately. The other thing that I had to learn is to bring closure to that conversation. Or else it just hangs around and there's this awkwardness. So to literally say, to the person, it's not a pattern, but it was important that we address this. So actually, when you walk out of the door, this is not an issue. Or actually, this is a pattern, and we have to now look at how we're going to put you on a development program in order to address this. But to bring closure to the conflict is really important whilst it lingers. And I think the other thing that is really important is not to allow something to build up to the point of frustration. Address things early before
Mm.
you're frustrated, because as soon as you're frustrated or as soon as you're angry, you're never going to get a good resolution out of it. And
Mm.
then I think the other thing is that, often as leaders, what you end up finding is that people bring their conflict to you. And it's just another way of gossip, isn't it? So,
Mm.
often people would come to me and say, oh, this is happening. And I don't want to expose the person, but, I just want you to be aware of this. And you think, well, part of being a leader is teaching others to be leaders. So I would say to them, it sounds a little bit like gossip to me, or it sounds like something that's not going to go away, but it's not my problem. It's yours. So I'm gonna set another meeting within 48 hours where you're going to tell me how the outcome happened. You need to go and talk to that person and then come back and tell me what was the outcome and if you still need any more help. And so two things happened. It made leaders really start owning their own issues, but also it stamped up a lot of gossip in my organization, which undermines culture completely, so that was good.
I love a couple of things that you said there. Take the problem from between us and put it on the table. That's powerful right there.
Yeah.
You taking it away from being personal. It's not us.
Yeah.
It's an it.
Yeah.
It becomes, instead of being subjective, it becomes objective by putting
Exactly.
it on the table. I love that. My words I've used is we bring light and not heat into a situation. Our aim is light and not heat. And to leave your emotion, out of it and to become objective. I really enjoy that analogy of that. Also, getting people to own responsibility for when they've fallen out with someone or they have an issue, which is what you did. And did it work? And what happens if you get to your 48-hour meeting and someone hasn't done that or hasn't sorted out? What did you do?
Well, then I would bring all three people in, which is a little bit more awkward to say, this person has brought this to my attention, is there an issue here? And let's sort it out.
Yeah.
But I think, Dave, there were times when I didn't handle conflict well. And I think part of the power of it is to not avoid the conflict. But when I didn't handle it well, I would apologize to the individual. I'd call them back in and say, you know what, I was too emotional. I brought an accusation before I'd actually, the Stephen Covey, seek first to understand. And if I had addressed a conflict publicly, I would then apologize publicly if I had handled it badly. So in a business review, I'd got frustrated or I wasn't happy with the outcome of a certain business leader or their department, and I had allowed my emotion to override my approach, I would apologize publicly. And so I think what my team learned was that we're not always going to do conflict well, but we can't ignore it. And if you haven't done it well, then just go and apologize.
Yeah.
But we can't ignore it.
Because we know with high performing teams that healthy conflict is part of the solution, is part of making a high performing team. Yeah. But there you have to be objective and not subjective in terms of keeping guard of your emotions. And I guess that's part of a great leader, right? Being aware of when the boiling is starting to happen and learning to step away or control your internal narrative. Now, you've mentioned a number of times as we've been chatting, you've used the word culture.
I want to plug out for your book too, by the way. Because, one of the things that I read this last week was say what you mean. And you wrote here that clarity is not unkind, avoidance is. So when expectations remain unspoken, frustration quietly grows. What isn't said often does more damage than what is. Saying what you mean calmly and respectively builds trust, even when it's uncomfortable. And Dave, honestly, it was one of the biggest things I had to learn. I would ramble because I just couldn't get the tough words out. And I had to, in the beginning, I almost had to script what I had to say. This was going to be a difficult conversation, and I had to script it so that it was absolutely clear what the solution was and what the expectation was of that individual. But I think it's all part of learning how to do conflict well.
But that's good advice right there is, actually my advice to leaders has been write down what you want to say and read it. Just simply read it in the room. You're not likely to be as emotional. You're likely to be more objective, and then give room for the person to respond. But say what you mean to say, which is so important. Yeah, great advice. Yeah, write it down, speak it. Don't wait for it. Great book too. Yeah, say what you mean to say. You said something a little earlier that your culture is as good as the value that you tolerate the least. Or probably misquoting you. Let's go back there a minute. Let's talk about culture and values in terms of team. How do you enforce or create lived out values in the teams that you've led? How do you do that?
So I think the very first thing is to define them. So often you have these mission statements and everything like that. And, you have your values, integrity,
Mm.
respect. I mean, every single company has the same values, but what is different is how is that experienced? What is the behavior that supports those values? And what are we going to role model as a leadership team? And what are the 5 critical behaviors that we want to disseminate to the organization, that we're going to hold ourselves accountable? So what I found I ended up doing was not holding my team accountable to the values, but accountable to the behaviors that we had agreed reflect those values, of which embracing conflict was one of them. Then, for me, I would encourage my leaders to do 2 things. Number one, there was a question that I wanted them to ask on a regular basis to make sure we were role modeling those behaviors, which is, what does it feel like to be on the other side of me? And, I remember the first time I asked that question to my leadership team. Honestly, Dave, I thought I was going to get 100% scorecard of just, you fabulous, and we love being, we love the that I asked that question about what does it feel like to be on the other side of me. For me, I was expecting that I was going to get this glowing report card where all my leaders just thought I was fantastic. But literally 50% of my leaders were frustrated. And the reason for that was because, those that were more sort of extroverted and all of that, they enjoyed the fact that I would come in and start our meeting by saying, "Hey, how's it going with you? How was your weekend?" Connect with them a little bit. Others of mine that were more introverted or more thinkers, in terms of their personality profile, had a list as long as their arm of things they wanted to get through. And suddenly I was asking them about their family or what they'd done on the weekend, and they were just hugely frustrated. And I think for me, talking about how do you create a culture that is not just words on a wall? I think part of what I had to do is not only define what those leaders' behaviors looked like, but had to make sure that I was demonstrating and role modeling how to adapt for the different types of personalities, and respect for half of my team was very different to respect for the other part of my team. As I said, the one part connecting with me showed that you respected me, that you valued me. For my other part of my team, it was that making sure we get through my list so that I have a clear sense of what I have to achieve this week was important to them. And I had to learn to adapt as a leader to all of those different profiles,
I love it because values and cultures, they drive an organization. They drive what you do, what you're supposed to do. And if you want to know what I love it, if you want to know what someone values, watch what they spend their money, where they spend their time, and you'll know where your value is. And an organization is watch for the behavior, because people reproduce who you are, not what you say you are.
Yeah.
Our kids become mini us's, and we look at our kids and go, "Who are you?" Well, actually, they're just mirroring the real us, right?
Exactly.
You're familiar maybe with the Johari window, which says we have this personal face that we know and they know, and then we have this blind spot that they know we don't. And I love the fact that you're constantly checking in with your team and saying, "What do you see?" And you go back to that lovely thing as we cast a shadow. What is the shadow? And then what are people reproducing? That's a good measure for us. I love that. So I got one more question.
Can I
go on.
just say what's really important on that, though, is to be aware of the behavior that you will demonstrate under pressure, when you're not being intentional about how you show up. Unintentional behavior never lands well, generally speaking, because when we all work in pressurized environments, so specifically for leaders, it's so important to know what behavior you demonstrate when under pressure. And normally your strength is just your. So I am motivating, I'm inspiring, I'm emotional. Those are all my strengths when I play them well. But under pressure, that emotion can come out in a very detrimental way. And so I think, part of it is not only being aware of your Johari window, but also really being intentional about the tendencies that would undermine your influence or erode the culture that you're trying to create, and making sure you show up well and you're being intentional about not demonstrating those behaviors.
Well said. I mean, pressure doesn't create character. Pressure reveals character, and it really reveals who you are. And a good leader reflects on those moments and then makes the adjustments. And it's what you do in your habits, in your daily rituals. It's that secret work that bears out under pressure in the public, right? Because the public get to see the lack or the work that's done in private. And actually that leads me really nicely as we're kind of landing the plane a little bit. I want to land with a question I was going to ask you at the beginning, but for a leader to grow, they have to do the work. They have to be intentional. They have to be consistent. They've got to be courageous. We know all these great words. What has been the work that you have had to do in the secret place, in your internal thinking, that has allowed you to be able to become the leader that you have? What is that work, and what advice would you give to younger leaders that are looking to develop themselves in terms of their own leadership?
So I think, okay, so firstly, the internal work that I've had to do is really do feel like part of my to even say that I've been able to be a good leader by the fruit of the people that I've led has only come because I first had to deal with my own stuff. All of us have not grown up in necessary optimal environments, but we all carry baggage of some sort, which generally under pressure is the thing that sort of comes to the surface. And so I think, for me, it was having to deal with my insecurities, having to deal with the fact that I always wanted to be liked, having to deal with my unintentional sort of behavior that would show under pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So I can't stress enough that part of authenticity is, to coin a phrase, is to deal with your own demons and to put them to rest. And then to start to think about, what am I when I'm leading at my best? Who have I been created to be, that with all these strengths and giftings and talents, who is that? And then to become comfortable in your own skin, rather than constantly comparing ourselves to somebody else. I remember when I first started as a leader, there was this whole thing of the Jack Welch, the GE, that type of leader. And his profile, I think, was an ENTP or an ENTJ. That was it. Yeah. And, well, I only got one of those. I was an E. Everything else I wasn't. But I was like, every time I did my Myers-Briggs, I would force myself to be this ENTJ. Thought, yes, I'm a leader. But I think we've got to become, all of us can be leaders. All of us, when we're leading out of a place of authenticity, then we lead well. We cast the shadow of our leadership that is flourishing for other people. They can flourish under. I love it. And what I realized, Dave, is often go to meetings in teams, important meetings, because what I realized is I wasn't going to be everybody's cup of tea. And so what I try to do is go to important meetings where I had enough diversity in my leadership team that any one of those key stakeholders would at least connect with somebody in my team, and it didn't have to be me. So my advice to young leaders wanting to really be good leaders is, firstly, do the hard graft about who you really are. Deal with the stuff that will trigger you or trip you up, and lead from a place of authenticity. And also just settle. that you cannot be all
Mm,
things to all people, that you're going to be those
that's
that
so good.
connect with you, you're going to be those that don't. And then know your Achilles heel, know the things that trigger you,
Mm,
and make sure that you're aware of them and that you're intentional about how you show up every single day. Because we know it takes months, years to build reputation, to build credibility that you can lose in a second
mm.
because you dropped the ball. So just be
Oh,
authentic
so.
and be comfortable with who you've been created to be and lead from that
Oh,
place.
I mean, that is just fantastic advice. Terry, I feel like we need to definitely do another couple of these. I could unpack each one of these points for another hour.
I'm
So
trying to.
I want to thank you. I think the key thing that comes over from your conversation is leadership is intentional. You don't ever stop being intentional. Leadership is, about understanding your vulnerabilities and leaning into them, but also understanding your strengths and leaning into those. Not being a person pleaser. Leader is about doing the work, being aware of your internal story. And I know, Terry, that you have impacted hundreds, if not thousands, of people's lives over the years. And I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing there,
Uh,
and invite you to come back and we'll do all this again at
Absolutely.
another time, which will be really, really good. So, Terry, on behalf of DB Labs and myself, I want to say a big thank you, and we wish you all the best. We'll chat soon.
Thank you so much, great man.